Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy. Today, Pranav and I are joined by Brian Weeden. Brian is Director of Program Planning at the Secure World Foundation. He's one of the leading voices on all matters relating to space in the world. And it's an absolute delight to have him here on All Things Policy. What we're going to talk about with Brian today is the U.S. Space Force. U.S. Space Force is mostly the object of derision, and there's a sitcom about it and so on. But we'd like to know what's actually going on, how this Space Force functions, why it exists. So firstly, welcome to Takshashila, Brian.
Very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Wonderful to have you. So can you just walk us through the origins of the Space Force? Why did it come about and what are its key roles? What does it do?
No, those are all great questions. And I think that the issue is that there was a lot going on this issue of military space for decades within the U.S., but it was sort of operating under the radar. A lot of people in the public didn't know it. They weren't aware of it. And then President Trump comes along and President Trump starts making all these pronouncements and talking publicly and sort of raise the visibility of it. And without sort of that back history of what had been happening, this really comes down to how should the United States organize its military space activities? The U.S. had been doing military things in space since before the space age. So in that interim period, end of the World War II and the early Cold War, 1950s, we were already doing some experiments, some testing, trying to figure out what the real benefits from space are. And from the earliest days of the space age, there was a strong military component to what the United States was doing in space. At that time, it was being done by the Air Force and the Navy and the Army in their separate roles as services. And there was a lot of competition and, competing, overlapping programs on things like ballistic missiles and other topics. And then they made a decision to make the United States Air Force the lead service for military space activities. And they created Air Force Space Command. And for several decades, they were the leaders in this. And they were the ones in charge of figuring out what the military should be doing in space. But in the early 2000s, there was this question of, is this really something we want to keep as a small function down inside the Air Force? Or like how the Air Force emerged out of the U.S. Army, is it now time to separate space out and make its own service that is on par with the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and others? Or do we keep it sort of as this thing down within the Air Force, make it a little more separate like our Marine Corps is? So our Marine Corps is part of the U.S. Navy, but it has a lot of its own separate functions. And so this had been going on for 20 years, since the beginning of the early 2000s. Very wonky policy debates back and forth, really in the weeds bureaucratic discussions, hadn't really gone anywhere until somehow this issue reached the desk of President Trump. And as I understand it, someone convinced him that if he was to call for a Space Force as a separate military service, that would be a big publicity thing. It would sort of make his name. And those are things he loves doing. So that's what happened. He didn't invent this notion. There was all these ideas been floating around, but President Trump provided the political willpower to do this and to force it through the system, and a lot of inherent resistance that was there. So what do we have today is we have the Space Force. It is not its own department like the Army, Navy, or the Air Force. It's actually part of the Department of the Air Force. So it's really like the Marines, but it has its own ability to procure weapons, to develop technologies, and to recruit and train people that is independent from the other services. And so that's what it is. And it basically just assumed doing all these duties that had already been done with Air Force Space Command. So I spent 9 years in the U.S. Air Force, and the last 3 years I was doing a space mission, and that mission just transferred over to the Space Force. And one of the big questions is, as the Space Force evolves, is it going to start doing new things in space that hadn't been done before? But for the moment, it's doing a lot of the same things that had been done by Air Force Space Commanders for decades.
Right. Does the Space Force subsume work done by the other services as well, like the Navy or the Army, or is that?
It depends.
It depends. Okay.
The Space Force is supposed to be the lead for procuring military satellites and developing space capabilities that are then used by all of the other services. However, that does not mean everything military based is going to be in the Space Force. A lot of the end user stuff. So for example, the Space Force is now responsible for the GPS satellite constellation and the future of space position navigation and timing. But the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force are responsible for buying all of the receivers that make use of those signals that get integrated into ships and planes and tanks. And that is still being done in them. And there may be other things those services still do in space. So a great example is aircraft, right? Even though we have the U.S. Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Marines all have their own aircraft and they all do their own air operations. In some cases, because the Air Force isn't supporting their needs. In other cases, they don't trust the Air Force to do everything, right? So I expect that dynamic to still happen.
Thank you for giving us the broad perspective on what the Space Force does. But the perception of the Space Force is largely inspired by Star Wars, Star Trek, and the fictionalized television show Space Force. But as Aditya and I have discussed several times in the podcast, Space Force and space operations are a lot more mundane, sometimes a lot more boring. So what are the functions of the Space Force? Specifically, when we talk about weapons and satellites, what do these capabilities actually do?
No, you're absolutely right. They are much more boring than what is portrayed. In fact, I think the most realistic part of Space Force, the TV show, was the budget hearing they had, and particularly the meeting before that, where the different services are giving each other a hard time. They're like ripping on the Coast Guard, and as the Space Force, the new people, and the Army sort of throwing their weight on. That is the most realistic part of that entire show. So really, what the Space Force is doing is they are operating satellites in space that are providing navigation signals like GPS. They're providing satellite communications. They're, collecting weather imagery of what's happening on the Earth. That's basically what they're doing. And they're also now operating and procuring what we would call counterspace technologies capabilities. So the ability to either interfere with somebody else's use of space or protect your own. At the moment, the only acknowledged counterspace system the U.S. has is a jamming electronic warfare system called the Counter Communication System. There may be other classified programs, especially one that's publicly acknowledged. And then the third thing they're doing is space situation awareness, or what they now call space domain awareness. So that is radars and telescopes and satellites that are keeping track of what's going on in space and all the objects there.
Well, you brought up budgets, and that's a very good segue to, I think, about Space Force budgets. At the end of last year, the Congress released the National Defense Authorization Act. And part of that conversation was that the US Space Force had a larger budget than NASA. Why is that US Space Force tech is so much more expensive than all these capabilities and satellites and programs that NASA has?
Yeah, this is a great question. This is actually part of the legitimate reasons to have a Space Force. Prior, when it was under the Air Force, there were several different occasions where the Air Force vetoed funding raises that would have gone to space because it would have taken away money they wanted for aircraft and air power reasons, or took money that Congress had appropriated to space and sort of used it for aircraft spending. So getting an independent space budget was always one of the rationales to have a Space Force. The other big thing to keep in mind here is that what we see in the annual authorization appropriations is not the entire budget. It's the open budget, the public budget. There's a whole classified black budget that isn't really reflected in those numbers, at least not entirely, that may be part of this as well. And then the third thing to keep in mind is that there's also something called the National Reconnaissance Office, which operates intelligence collection satellites from space. And that exists separate from the Space Force and has its own budget that falls out on the intelligence side. So back to your question, yes. In recent years, the military space budget, Space Force, has been larger, somewhat larger, by a couple $1 billion or so than NASA's budget. And that's just the acknowledged things. I'm sure there are probably other Black programs that are sort of related to that are not reflected in those numbers. In part, that's because the U.S. military is heavily reliant on space. Pretty much everything the U.S. military has done in the last 25, 30 years has required space to function. And relative to our overall military budget, which is something on the order of $800 billion US this year, spending 28 or so on military space is a tiny fraction of that. Right. So a lot of this is because the US government spends a ton on its military, and NASA is a very, very, very small portion of that. That's really what was reflected there.
Right. So it would seem that creation of Space Force doesn't necessarily lead to a rise in the overall US defense budget, or at least not a significant one. Is that correct?
They have increased spending on space. Whether or not that is a function of the Space Force, it's hard to tell, right, because there were already arguments to grow it because of the growing reliance on space by the US military and concerns about protecting those assets. So there has been growing pressure to increase the military space spending. And you can argue that the Space Force helped make that possible, but it's not a direct correlation. At least I don't think.
Right. So, I mean, the tasks of the Space Force might seem a little mundane, but I don't think it's mundane that a whole new service is created, right? It's quite rare. So how is that supposed to work? So I'm assuming that the initial lot of people came from the Air Force, largely, maybe the other services. So is the Space Force going to start recruiting folks directly?
No, and you're right. And that's actually why I was one of the people arguing against the creation of the Space Force, because the best argument for the Space Force was that the existing institution, as it was structured and as it had its culture, was incapable of solving some of these really hard problems about modernizing the way we do acquisitions, on creating a professional space cadre. And they needed to change both the organization and the culture to be able to do those. But that's a huge undertaking, right? We've seen that, right? It's been now almost 3 years since we created the Space Force, and they're still figuring out uniforms and songs and mottos and all of this structural kind of mundane stuff just to then get to the really hard things that they need to solve. So yes, there was originally one person, right? There was the chief of space operations, right, General Raymond. He was the only person. And they then had to create this new structure, and then they transferred people into it from the other services. And yes, originally they said about 6,000 or so people, mainly coming from Air Force Space Command. Right. But there's also been a few hundred from the Army and from the Navy and from the others that have now transferred in. But it's still very, very small. They're talking about a force structure of 8,000 people or so. Maybe in the future, they might grow to 10 or 15, but it's extremely small compared to the other services in the US military.
And for me, it's quite confusing that even though you have 10,000 personnel in the Space Force, these space operations that are being carried out is by a completely different agency or organization called the US Space Command. Why is such a structure chosen, and what is the rationale of separating recruitment, training, and procurement from operations?
Yeah, this is a very common question. I get this a lot, even in the US, even the US government, there's a lot of understanding of this. So the way the US military has been structured since the 1970s is there are two parallel organizations. There are the military services that are given the task of recruiting people, of procuring equipment and training. And then there are the combatant commands, which are responsible for actually planning and carrying out military operations. And the same entities can actually be part of both. So the example I use is that the U.S. military's involvement in Afghanistan, that was all done through U.S. Central Command because it is a geographic area. And we said, okay, anything happening in this part of the world falls under CENTCOM. There's also Northern Command, Southern Command, European Command, Indo-Pacific Command, but that happened under Central Command. So the U.S. president says, I need a plan for a military operation to go in and invade Afghanistan and take out the Taliban. The Central Command commander, Tommy Franks, falls upon him to go do that. He comes up with a plan and he says, okay, to execute this plan, I need X number of Army divisions and X number of Air Force wings and X number of, naval battleships and cruisers and whatever. And then the services are tasked to send all those things over, and they basically get handed over to CENTCOM and used to fight the war, and then they rotate home and new things come in. That is how it works outside of space. The unique part about space is that when we deploy, we don't really go anywhere. So for example, when I was working, I was a U.S. Air Force officer, and I was recruited and trained by the Air Force. And I was operating a system procured by the Air Force. But when I was doing my job, I was working for U.S. Strategic Command, because when I was in, they were the combatant commander for space. So I would go to work and I would have a patch on my uniform that says U.S. Strategic Command, and they were the ones directing the day-to-day operations using the equipment procured by the Air Force and people trained by the Air Force. So that same thing happens. It is now just the Space Force doing the training and procurement, and then U.S. Space Command that is actually directing the operations that happen day in and day out.
That's really fascinating. And you brought up STRATCOM. And my, other question is, the United States has a constellation of early warning satellites. This is the space-split infrared system at the moment, which will get upgraded in a few decades. Who controls the early warning system?
Yes. So the currently warning system, and that's because of SBIRS as well as a mix of older DSP satellites, they were procured by the U.S. Air Force. It's complicated because they're used for multiple missions, but they're basically used by both U.S. Strategic Command and by the U.S. Space Force because they're used for both missile warning and they're used for some other functions Space Force does. I think they're controlled by the Space Force these days, but this is where we get into space being a little bit different, right? If I assign a fighter wing to go, be in Afghanistan or Central Command, they can't also support U.S. Southern Command in operating in Latin and South America because they can't do both at once, but space can, right? GPS is supporting operations in all the different AORs, as well as supporting U.S. Space Force. So this is what's really unique about space is U.S. Space Command can both be a supporting combatant command that provides capabilities to other services, as well as a supported combatant command where others send forces to help out space. So that's what makes it really confusing. And there's actually been many years of policy debates on there. Something called the unified, the UCP, the Unified Command Plan, which sort of ties all this together. Doctrine really not a public document, unfortunately, but there's a lot of detail here.
That's interesting. I mean, it's fascinating to see how it's actually structured. I think there's one question about Space Force that a lot of people have. I think the common perception in India is that this is primarily because the US wants to develop counter space capabilities. US considers space a warfighting domain. Space Force allegedly has plans for the moon. What is your take on this?
Well, as I said, 90% of what the Space Force is doing is providing military space services, GPS, weather, communications, all that kind of, that is the vast majority of what they're doing. They also do some counter-space stuff. As I mentioned, the electronic warfare program, the CCS is the one we know about. There may be others, and SSA on the side. And of course, there may be some black programs that we're not aware of. But when you look at the budget, those are small numbers compared to the amount of money spent on DSP, on SIBRs, on AHF, on these, other sort of services that they're providing. I think something that happened at the same time the Space Force was created, there was also a policy decision to talk about space as a warfighting domain publicly. And I think that is adding to the misperceptions here. The US military has long considered space to be a warfighting domain and has thought about that. We have records of space order of battle and target lists dating back to the late 1970s. And in the 1960s, there were plans for, military warfare and operation space. But we didn't talk about it publicly. There was a policy decision not to do that for concerns that it would be perceived as weaponization and it would conflict with sort of the peaceful use of space we wanted to promulgate. So it was there, we just didn't talk about it. And that was another change the Trump administration made, was they said, we are now going to talk publicly about space as a warfighting. But honestly, warfighting in space, it is people sitting behind consoles at the ground at the computers, clicking in commands and telling satellites to do stuff. It is not TIE fighters. It's not any of that kind of stuff. It's much more boring.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks, Brian. On that note, we'll end this episode and we hope to have you back on All Things Policy soon enough.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.